Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this press avail. I want to spend a couple of moments going through some of the legislative activity and committee activity that's going on. Then I'll open it up for questions. Val from my office will help navigate this, so if you've got a question, please contact or I think Val's probably given you some instructions. So let's start. We finally have the organizing resolution in place for the 117th Congress. I'm proud to say that I will be the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. I'll be the first Virginian to have that position as chairman since my predecessor, John Warner. I'm very proud to follow in his footsteps. And on the Intel Committee, just very briefly, really proud of the last 4 years where I was vice chair, the fact that we kept our bipartisan bona fides on a very difficult Russia investigation. We were the first committee to discover and point out the level of foreign intervention in social media. We pointed out and carried out more than a dozen classified briefings to American business leadership and academia about the challenging rise of China and the economic and security threats it poses. We also pointed out in certain areas like 5G, we were the first committee to point out that specific technology and the challenge it poses to our country. On a going forward basis, for the committee, I want to make sure that we maintain its bipartisan reputation. In terms of national security, in terms of intelligence, we've got to make sure that we back up our intelligence professionals, that they have the ability to speak truth to power. On a personal basis, I want to have the committee look at the rise of anti-government extremism in this country. It's oftentimes ties to anti-government extremist groups in Europe and oftentimes amplified by Russia. I want to continue to do a deep dive on China, not only looking at 5G, but other areas where China's technological investments may be competing with America. One area I've already got some legislation done was around semiconductors, but China continues to be a focus of the committee. I want us to continue our work into misinformation and disinformation. Again, oftentimes promoted on many of these social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And then as not only chair of the Intelligence Committee, but as also the co-chair of the Cyber Caucus, really want to go deep into not only the SolarWinds hack, but the whole notion of what is espionage, what is government-to-government type conflict within the cyber domain. As is evidenced by SolarWinds, we are still vulnerable. Our adversaries are still willing to take advantage of those vulnerabilities, and this is a subject that we keep coming back to, but we've still got a long way to go. I also wanted to very briefly mention, before we get to questions, a couple of pieces of legislation that I've introduced in these first days of this new Congress. 3 bills that are similar to bills that I've introduced in the past. One was a piece of legislation, bipartisan, that looks at addressing the challenge around food deserts. I think with COVID, we've seen the numbers in Virginia where 1 out of 8 Virginians have had some level of food insecurity over the last 30 days. I think we've all seen these enormous lines at our food banks. And even when you get people back to some level of food security, making sure they have access to healthy food is a terribly important component, making sure that there's fresh fruits and vegetables, meat and fish. This legislation would provide tax credits and tax breaks to construction of grocery stores in food desert areas, further assistance for food banks, mobile food distributors of healthy food venues, and we can get into more details if anyone wants. I also put forward legislation yesterday that would address some of the challenges around Obamacare, where I hope we would see some of the reforms. My legislation allows insurance companies to sell insurance plans across state lines as long as there are appropriate consumer protections. It would also cap any Affordable Care Act premiums at 8.5% of a person's income. So an ability to cap those provisions. It also allows a public option. These are all areas that I would hope we would see some healthcare reform. Then today, I'll be introducing legislation leading a number of Democrats on what I called last Congress, the SAME Act. What the SAME Act does is would allow a state like Virginia, who was frankly late to doing Medicaid expansion, to give that full federal match for the whole time period that was provided to states that expanded Medicaid earlier on. This would make up, I think, for Virginia's mistake to expand Medicaid earlier. What we would also do is provide that same long-term federal match for the 12 states around the country that have not expanded Medicaid. I think we are past those discussions. I think it is, as is the case been shown in Virginia, expanding Medicaid is great for those poor and underserved Virginians, but it's also a lifeline, particularly to our rural areas. Without that Medicaid expansion, the level of hurt that so many of our rural hospitals are already going through would be exponentially worse. So I've got a lot more legislation planned. I'm very enthusiastic about this Congress. I feel like in the last 6 months of the last Congress, I put a lot of points on the board in terms of legislative wins. I was very proud of the role I had in crafting the last COVID relief package in a bipartisan fashion. I'm working with that same bipartisan group going forward. And I know with all of the news going on around, it's hard to be sometimes optimistic, but I am extraordinarily optimistic about this Congress and look forward to your questions. I stayed away from the COVID relief and impeachment because I figured you guys would all ask on those subjects. But Val, why don't we go ahead and open up the floor for questions?
Okay, great. Up next we have Amy from the Virginia Dogwood.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with all of us today. My question is actually about the food insecurity that you were talking about. I know that there are still a lot of people who might not qualify for like the SNAP benefits, for the EBT cards, who might not be able to afford really healthy food. What is your plan to help those people, please?
Well, also, Val, could we turn up the volume on our reporters a little bit, because I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing Amy. But let me go through, Amy, two pieces. One, in the last COVID package, we bumped up SNAP benefits, expanded them, I believe, by 15%. In the package that President Biden has proposed, there are increased benefits as well. So that goes to the question of people having the resources to buy healthy food. But as we know, the challenge is, even if you've got resources, if you live in a food desert, which means more than a mile away from a spot that sells healthy food in an urban area, more than, I believe it was 15 miles in a rural area. If you don't have access to healthy food, if you're only going to a convenience store that only has some pre-processed foods, you're not going to have that healthy diet that you need. Failure to have that healthy diet presents itself in type 2 diabetes, it presents itself in hypertension, it presents itself in high cholesterol levels. That leads to challenges that we see play out in COVID right now, as individuals that have those unhealthy lifestyles are more susceptible to COVID. What my legislation does is less focus on the affordability side, which is SNAP, and more focus on, can we get the physical structures in place? It is a 15% one-time tax credit for construction of new grocery stores in food deserts. The grocery store would have to provide healthy foods. It is a smaller credit for renovation of potentially a convenience store that might convert and have more healthy food options. It does support food banks. It also says, can we take advantage of food trucks and other kind of more cutting edge distribution models on healthier foods. This is an area there is broad bipartisan support. My lead co-sponsor on this legislation is my friend Jerry Moran, Republican senator from Kansas, big ag state, but they have a lot of food deserts in Kansas as well. So we've made some progress on this, but not as much as needs to be. And my hope is that coming out of COVID, we'll think about not only how people have the resources to get access to food, but to make sure that access is actually to healthy food. Thanks for the question.
Up next,
Thank you
we
so
have.
much.
Oh, thank you. Up next, we have Pete from WDBJ.
Good morning,
Peter,
Senator. One of the things that we have been hearing from people down in Southwest Virginia is concerns over the post office and slow delivery, issues with things getting delivered. What can be done between you and Senator Kaine on the federal level to make sure that these issues are being resolved?
Well, I'm so glad you raised that. I should have done that in my opening comments. And let me just echo what I'm hearing literally from thousands and thousands of Virginians. Give you two examples. Just this past week, my birthday's December 15th. I had a relative of mine who I thought, gosh, forgot my birthday this year. She sent me a birthday card on December 11th. It was the end of January before I got that birthday card. I also had another relative send me a Christmas card on December 21st. I didn't get it until February. So this is outrageous. It is a case, I think, where we've got a completely incompetent Postmaster General in Mr. DeJoy, who is nothing but a political hack appointee of the previous president. We caught him trying to disrupt the Postal Service around the election system. Thank God we were able to rein him in, and ballots were delivered on time. But by cutting back, and this is not the postal workers' fault. I mean, the postal workers have been trying to do their job, but this individual has cut back on overtime. He removed a number of mail processing machines. The level of disruption, for me, it's only been cards from relatives, but if you are dependent upon the Postal Service to get your medicine during COVID, if you are waiting for one of these checks, if you're about to pay your income taxes, this is outrageous. And Tim Kaine and I think the whole congressional delegation has weighed in with DeJoy. We have not received a satisfactory answer. The problem is that President Biden can't just fire DeJoy individually. He would have to fire the whole board and reconstitute the whole board. If we don't see improvement, if we don't see the ability for this individual who is, again, a political hack and incompetent, to be reversed, then I think President Biden ought to consider firing the whole board to get rid of him, because this is not fair. This is the one piece of our government, while not perfect, but the postal workers through thick and thin do their job. They performed admirably during the election season, but clearly I've seen numbers drop as much as 40% in terms of on-time delivery in late December and into early January. This is unacceptable. And Mr. DeJoy needs to go, or needs to also allow these workers the overtime, put the processing machinery back in place, because it is a travesty what's happened to our Postal Service.
Up next, we have Hannah from WSET.
Hey there. I just had a follow-up on the legislation about food insecurity. I know a lot of the language in there is talking about more long-term solutions to the problem in terms of tax credits for future builds. But is there anything in there, anything that you can do specifically in rural communities in Virginia to kind of give a more immediate or short-term solution to the immense need that we're seeing in those communities?
Well, what we have had some there is some funding in our bill that would help sponsor farmers markets, to help create more infrastructure around farmers markets. Again, that's only, let me acknowledge, a stopgap effort. Most of the efforts in terms of short term, like what can we do tomorrow, what can we do next week for Virginians in food insecurity, is around the question of expanding SNAP, EIBT, and other existing programs. We took a good step on this, bipartisan, in the last COVID bill. President Biden has got, and I don't recall the number, but I believe it's close to $30 billion plus in his legislation, not all around SNAP, but around food insecurity issues. And my hope is we'll see bipartisan support, at least for that component. That would be immediate, but it doesn't, it will help with food insecurity. It won't help as much in terms of actual infrastructure to make sure that you've got a location other than a convenience store that you can go to that would provide that healthy food. Short term, I do think that the farmers markets are part of an option in rural Virginia.
Up next, we have Brendan from WTKR.
Hi, Senator. One of the things that's been discussed in the COVID relief package is raising the federal minimum wage. Do you think that should be something included in a COVID relief package? And could you also just speak to your overall thoughts on the issue of raising minimum wage?
Well, I support raising the minimum wage. $7.25 we've not raised in Virginia, I believe, since 2009. And that was when the last federal increase came to bear. And you work 40 hours a week, you're still below the poverty line. So I've signed on to the legislation that would raise the minimum wage to $15. It would phase in over 4 years. The Virginia General Assembly has already done the same. They phased it in by 2026. The federal legislation with 2025. To get enough votes, I'm willing to look at altering a little bit of the phase-in date. But I think in America, if you're working full-time, you ought to be able to put food on your table and a roof over your head. And unfortunately, at $7.25, you can't do that. And getting ourselves to $15, as we've seen other communities and other states do that, it has not created the kind of loss of job or destruction of small businesses that was advocated. I agree there may be some debate about what the phase-in period ought to be, but the idea of, and there's never a perfect time, and I know the governor delayed the implementation in Virginia because of COVID. I understand that, but we've got to start down that path because each year that we punt, we put more people into poverty. And if we don't start this process, you're going to end up, we have literally tens of millions of Americans that between that $7.25 and that $15 are really living on the economic edge. We've seen what happens during a period like COVID. We ought to prevent that, and part of that will mean phasing in this increase on minimum wage. Let me also, as long as we're on, I know we're going to probably get to some more questions on the COVID relief package, but let me raise one other area. I generally think the COVID package has two components. One is how do we get more vaccines out into the community, more people with shots as quickly as possible? How do we make sure we continue to increase testing, PPE capability? And I know we are all exhausted from this close to year venture we've been through, but I do think we're at that proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. The second is the stimulus, and I do believe that the economy needs additional stimulus dollars. We have such a strange recovery at this point. The stock market's at close to a record high, but we also have more Americans who are food insecure than at any time in our last 50 years. So this economy, and I think again about so many small businesses who are just holding on, restaurants that are just holding on, we do need additional stimulus. One thing I'm very focused on, though, is there are places in President Biden's proposal where I think the funds could be better spent. I am very much in favor of tailoring the relief checks to those who are lower income or those who've lost their jobs, the people that are making $250,000, $300,000 a year that have suffered no economic harm, I don't think should be getting checks. I also think, while I'm a former governor, strong advocate of state and local government assistance. We've lost over 1 million workers at state government level and local government level across our country. I think, again, some of that ought to be tailored. Some communities are doing fine. Some communities, I think about in Virginia, like the Williamsburg area, big tourism area, they're getting really hard hit. So we ought to tailor those dollars in the state and local government to those state and local governments who have been hurt the most. One goal that I have as we try to find areas where perhaps Biden has not directed dollars appropriately, I'm going to make a strong case, and I think I'll get bipartisan support for this, to take close to $50 billion out of this proposal, and I've got a variety of places I'm looking to take it, and put that in to a national broadband deployment plan. The one lesson I think we've all learned from COVID is that broadband is not a nice to have, it is a necessity in 2021. And if we put this plan in place, and frankly, we could do it through a lot of, through state governments, because they have the flexibility to really expand broadband maybe in ways that are not captured by the incumbent providers, we could get over 95% of Americans getting full coverage within 2 years. We also need to make sure that coverage is affordable. But if there was ever a time that provides both stimulus relief, tries to equip Americans and Virginians to live in this new world where studying at home, working at home, telehealth, even once we got vaccines, is not going away. We need to make that broadband commitment, and I'm very hopeful that that will become part of the final plan.
Up next, we have Michael Martz from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Again, that's Michael.
Good morning, Senator.
Hey, Michael.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good morning. I was originally going to ask about the Postal Service, but you've already handled that. Let me ask you about instead the approach to the COVID package using reconciliation. I know many of the Republican senators with whom you worked on the last package, notably Senator Collins, had advocated a smaller package, a different approach, a bipartisan approach. How do you come down on using reconciliation for a party line vote if necessary to pass the package?
Well, Michael, I absolutely believe that if we can get a bipartisan package, that's better. And let me make clear, the reason why I favor a bipartisan package is not because it makes the specifics of the deal better, but it does mean then both parties have to buy in to the results. Because chances are, on this package, as in any piece of legislation, we're not going to get it 100% right. So if there are mistakes made, then both parties have to be responsible for trying to fix it after the fact. So I think there is enormous value. The flip side of that, though, is that I think what my Republican friends put forward does not nearly meet the needs that are out there. And I was disappointed that a lot of my Republican friends, at least started the discussion with being terribly critical of President Biden rather than saying, okay, he's got to start, we're going to come in. So I'm glad that President Biden met with them. I think their package doesn't meet the mark. I think it is way too small. I think what we're doing with the reconciliation process, and I've expressed this to the White House, I have no problems with having a dual path where we continue to talk with our Republican colleagues with the goal of seeing, can we get a real package in place that will get bipartisan support. But we need to keep the pressure on, and reconciliation has been used 17 times over the last, I think, couple decades. And things like the CHIP program, I believe, was put in a bipartisan way through reconciliation. But we also saw my Republican friends jam through a tax cut without any Democratic support, and they had no qualms about using reconciliation under President Trump. So there's a little bit of a little political jousting going on here. I think keeping the pressure on with reconciliation will force a more fruitful bipartisan conversation about what that package might look like. And then, if there isn't a way where if my Republican colleagues aren't willing to go with the full reconciliation package, we will still have an opportunity to shape that package, shape the real details, make sure we get the $50 billion, for example, for broadband during the negotiation process. So I think there's a lot more chapters to be written in this story. Again, I'm hoping for bipartisan, but at the end of the day, I think we need to make the kind of economic investment to get this economy going. And as we've seen, at least based on recent polling, about 70% of Americans agree with the president's proposal, and I think that kind of overwhelming bipartisan support means we need to translate that into action.
Up next, we have Mike Gooding from WVEC.
Hey there, Senator. Just quickly, your thoughts on Secretary of Defense Austin ordering a stand-down of the entire United States military to address the issue of extremism in the ranks.
I think Secretary Austin has done the right thing. I think over the last few years, we have seen the growth of anti-government extremism across this country. And there is some of this on both sides, both on the left and the right. But let me make not the false equivalency. The vast majority, based on evidence, has been on the right wing. And what is particularly troubling to me is that law enforcement was seeing this. Our intel community was seeing these right-wing groups receive amplification and at least propaganda support from Russia. We saw these extremist groups many times in contact with anti-government extremist groups in Europe. This is not simply an American phenomenon. What we also saw, particularly under Donald Trump, was such a fear of offending Donald Trump that anti-government extremism that was appearing around the country, unfortunately at times even within our armed forces, was not called out, was not highlighted, in many ways was underplayed because there was fear that it might be, you might receive criticism from the Trump White House. I think that is outrageous. I think it was un-American of that former White House, and I think it is very appropriate that the Secretary of Defense and law enforcement highlight this issue to the American public in a way that we see it for what it is. It is a threat to our democracy. There have been more Americans killed by domestic terrorists over the last few years than by foreign-based terrorists. And we need to recognize the threat that exists. We need to recognize and learn from some of the tactics that we've used for de-radicalization abroad may have to be used here in this country. Because when you see the kind of insurrection that took place on January 6th, when you see 5 people died and 1 law enforcement officer and 50 law enforcement officers wounded. Within a democracy, these kind of actions cannot stand. This was not a protest. This was an insurrection led by extremist groups that we're going to see more and more evidence were coordinated and were had the goal of following Donald Trump's orders, and if that meant harming law enforcement officers or destroying our Capitol or taking out elected officials, whether it be Speaker Pelosi or Vice President Pence, that is a threat to our country. And I can assure you from the intelligence standpoint, the intelligence community needs to be more forthcoming to us as policymakers, and then we need to be more forthcoming to the American public about the seriousness of this threat.
The last question will come from Taj at WSLS.
Thanks again, Senator, for your time. This is kind of an overarching question. We've had the new Congress in place for a few weeks now, and with all of your goals, whether it's stimulus checks, whether it's raising the minimum wage, whether it's broadband expansion, how optimistic are you that this new Congress will work together and push America forward to where you hope it will be by the time this Congress convenes?
I'm actually pretty optimistic. I'm really proud of what happened on the last COVID bill, where a group of us, it started with 8 of us, 4 from each party, it grew, said we're tired of the political jabbing from people that can't seem to get to yes. We put a plan together, got 92 votes. I think President Biden has come in with the right spirit of trying to work together, but also saying, hey, we got to put some relief in place for Americans, millions of Americans who are hurting. I can tell you on the Intelligence Committee, I think we've built a record of bipartisanship. I think we've got an aggressive agenda, and we're going to continue our bipartisan work. So I may be naively optimistic, but I think there is a whole lot of at least, and let me speak most of the Senate. I can't speak to the House, which always a little bit bizarre to me. But in the Senate, the vast majority of my Senate colleagues, Democrat and Republican, realize what happened on January 6th should never happen again. Realize that some of the antics of the previous president, whether they vote to impeach or not, were frankly just downright un-American, and we don't want to go back to that kind of non-fact-based world. That appreciate the idea that that under Biden we're going to try to return to a science-based approach to things like COVID. You know, we'll have our feuds and fights and disagreements, but I think we saw how perilous and how precious our democracy is. And the truth is, it was under a level of assault under the previous administration that was unprecedented. And I believe the vast majority of my colleagues don't want to return to that kind of era. I think American public don't want us to go back to that kind of non-fact-based agenda. There are clearly a minority of Americans who still espouse these wacky theories like QAnon, but I think they are a distinct minority. So, and I know it's early on, maybe you ought to ask me this question again by summer, but I'm starting frankly this Congress more enthusiastic and more optimistic than I've been in years. And Val, I don't know if we got any more, but maybe I'm like, newsflash, Warner ends on optimistic note. I don't know whether that,
Yeah, I think that was the last question. Yep, that was the last question.
All right, so don't anybody come in here and try to point out the 17 things where I shouldn't be optimistic on. But thank you all for tuning in today, and look forward to talking more in the future. Thanks, everybody.